Okay, so now we looked at a lot of good, hearty, dismal, depressing things. We've looked at how you can tax sellers and the consumers still end up paying part of the tax. Or you could try to tax consumers and the sellers still end up paying part of the tax. And then we looked at how taxes, net of what the government gets, reduce consumer and seller surplus and are inefficient. So this has been some really good doom and gloom stuff that I pretty much kind of thrive on, if that's not obvious. So I don't know if this is taking it a step further or not, but it's certainly, we're going to get into, well, what if this? What would that mean to those doom and gloom kinds of things? What if that? What would that mean to these doom and gloom kinds of things? So what I'm saying is, let's suppose for just a second, I'll start over here, that this is what the market for a good looks like that. And this could be it. There would be the equilibrium price of it, and there would be the equilibrium quantity of it. And now we're going to go ahead and tax this thing. And we already saw it doesn't matter who we tax. Let's go ahead and I'll tax the sellers. That's fine. Let's levy a tax on the sellers, because after all, there are only a few sellers, and we like people, so we don't want to tax the consumers. Let's go ahead and tax the sellers and see what happens when our curves look the way that I've drawn them here. Now, if I tax the sellers, I'm talking about the supply side, that will decrease supply. That will move supply to the left. This is a decrease in supply. If you're not seeing that, you're falling for the Jedi mind trick. I warned you about that when we first talked about supply. That's a decrease in supply. It is a decrease of supply vertically, exactly the height of the tax is what it is. Now look, the quantity it demanded doesn't fall very much. The market barely shrunk when the curves are shaped like this. Look what happened to the price paid, though. The price paid went way up. The price received didn't fall very much. So who was made worse off relative to the other party? Both parties are made better off. Worse off. The buyers and sellers are both made worse off, right? The price went up that the sellers or the buyers have to pay. The price went up. The price went down that the sellers will receive. But the price went up by more than the price went down. Even though we tax the sellers, the consumers are paying more of this tax. They're also bearing more of that incidence in the form of their loss to consumer surplus than the sellers are losing in seller surplus. Let me do it again, but let's go ahead and try something different. Let's model these where instead of demand being shaped like that, supply is. And that has a name. Oh, I forgot to label my horizontal axis down here, didn't I? We'll tax that. And the market for that, let's say the market for that looks something like this. Now you see what I mean? Supply is the one that's much more vertical. Oh, that's terrible. In this market. And I'll go ahead and decrease supply again. It really won't matter, will it? So I'll tax supply, it'll decrease supply. It'll decrease supply vertically by the height of the tax, something like that. Now this becomes the price paid. And this becomes the price received. So who's bearing the burden of that tax? The price paid only rose a little. The price received fell a lot. That's a big loss to seller surplus. That's a big loss to the sellers. So let's try to think about what makes that so. Why is it that this time around, in the market for that, the sellers are bearing more of the burden of the tax, but in the first go around for this market for it, the consumers were bearing more of the burden of the tax. With a line that's more upright, more vertical, that tells you who's going to bear more of the burden of the tax. When you take a micro class, or when you delve into it in micro, that's called being inelastic or inflexible. I find it easy to think about who's going to bear the burden of the tax like this. Whoever is less flexible will bear more of the burden of the tax. Elasticity in a nutshell goes like this. Here's a demand curve. Here's another demand curve. This demand curve tells me that even if the price gets jacked way up, the quantity demanded by these consumers only falls a little bit. They need it bad. You could jack the price up and they'll continue to buy it at a reasonably, almost the same level. Look at this. If you jack the price up just a little bit on these consumers, just a little bit, what happens? Their consumption, their quantity demand plummets. They don't need that. I'll do something else. You raise the price, I'm out of here. These folks are flexible. These folks are inflexible. This is called an inelastic demand curve. This is called an elastic demand curve. This over here is an inelastic supply curve. A flatter supply curve would be an elastic supply curve. It works the same way, except it's the sellers. Whoever's less flexible or has a more vertical curve is going to bear more of the burden of the tax. And then the public policy implications of this that I think are fun to think about is, well, what kind of things are people inflexible about? Necessities and things that people are addicted to. Here's another I'll leave you with this really fun application of what we're talking about. Let me just change colors completely, and I can squeeze it in, I think, right here. And let's say I tax a market where the consumers what? Really need it. Let's just make the sellers neutral. And we'll call this a market for something. And I'll go ahead and tax the sellers. That's going to decrease supply. Price paid jumps a lot. Quantity doesn't fall very much. This is all repetitive, right? Price received doesn't fall very much because it's those consumers that were really, they need it. It's a necessity. Now, remember the deadweight loss? Like that rectangle is the government revenue, right? Because this height was the tax. Tax times the amount that's being sold in the market. That's the government revenue. So this rectangle is the government revenue when I tax an item like this. The triangle over here, it comes from both sides, but that triangle, that little sliver of a triangle, that's the deadweight loss in that market. This thing, if we tax this thing for which the demand curve is very inelastic. So up here, let me try to redo that kind of thing. But this time, let's say the consumers are more flexible. They can leave the market. And the sellers, I'll make about the same way. And that would be the equilibrium price in this market. So I've got, let's see, I have it, I have that, and I have thing. And I'll call this another, as in another thing. It's some other thing. Well, let's go ahead and tax those sellers again. And I'll tax them about the same height as I did down there. Vertically, it raises supply, but this is a decrease in supply. That came out pretty well. It's about the same height. Now, the market has really fallen here, hasn't it? Look at that. Market quantity has fallen quite a bit. The price paid has only risen a little. Price received has fallen quite a bit. But here's the fun thing to think about. Look at the size of that dead weight loss triangle. Look what happens when the curves are more elastic. The inefficiency is greater. Taxing things where people can be more flexible reduces the market even more and leads to greater inefficiency. Also, notice the height of the tax is about the same. I did a pretty good job freehand. The height of the tax is about the same, but look at the size of this rectangle. This isn't just because of my sketching. This rectangle down here is bigger. Taxing the thing that people really, really need to buy or sell yields better returns for the government. Taxing things that people don't need so much, well, they don't need it so much, so they don't pay the tax. They leave the market, and it doesn't yield as big of a bang for their effort for the government. So the things that are most desirable to tax are the things that are most necessary, our needs, the things we either need to buy if we're talking about demand, or need to sell if we're talking about supply. They're desirable to tax in the sense that they're more efficient to tax those things. Are they desirable to tax in the sense of fairness or social justice? No. Again, I introduced this with there being a trade-off between these kinds of things, and I think this, I can't tell you by your faces, but I'm pretty sure this brings it on home.